can, of course, if you need to step outside, uh, hopefully you'll be able to join and talk at the meeting. My name is Richard White. I am Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Political Military Analysis here at the Hudson Institute. I want to welcome everybody coming in so early, but we all know how important the topic is today about comprehensive threat reduction, something that's enjoyed bipartisan strong support for several decades. The proceedings are being filmed, and we will post video and audio on our website thereafter. In addition, it's also webcast live, so people mail in and enter during proceedings questions. Question asked. How it's going to go is we're going to have after my brief introduction, we're going to have Andrew and the ambassador engage in a dialogue about comprehensive threat reduction. I think get some background, a little background about the CTR program. And then it will open it up for audience participation, both online and in the area. For people here, logistics, the food in the back, the rest out here, side room, you can get that. If you turn off all communication devices, please, now, that would be helpful. No interruptions. And just to clarify the background, this is a joint project we've been doing at least 1 year with the Partnership for Secure America, and now we've got the Stanley Foundation joining us this year. The Partnership for Secure America is a nonprofit organization founded by former Representative Lee Hamilton and Senator Warren Rudman to advance bipartisanship on foreign policy and national security issues. The Stanley Foundation, which is helping our outreach beyond the DC area and has a special interest in threat reduction and nuclear material, nuclear security of nuclear materials, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, private operating foundation with programming focused on promoting and building support principle multilateralism and addressing international issues. We are all being supported by the Connect US Fund. This is the second year of Connect US Fund grant. They give grants to a lot of the organizations in DC and beyond. They want to promote collaboration between different organizations, hence the linking of 2 and now 3 groups. Their basic objectives to promote responsible U.S. global engagement through grant making and advance critical foreign policy, nuclear security, one issue, climate change, another, and so on. And some of the topics we dealt with earlier this year include START and security of Pakistan's nuclear weapons. Last year, we looked at what was happening in Iran, Korea, Nuclear Security Summit, a lot of activities with ambassadors engaged in, and other people in the audience. Just going to finish with a brief introduction. Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins currently serves as the State Department's coordinator for threat reduction programs in the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation. Before that, she's a program officer in U.S. foreign security policy at the Ford Foundation. She has a very impressive resume. She has a PhD in international relations, a law degree from Georgetown University, and also has served as a retired reserve officer. She had a previous career in government, serving for 9 years as legal advisor at the Office of General Counsel and U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Andrew Semmel, as people who've been to these events before, participates frequently. He works with PSA and others. He's a private consultant at AKS Consulting. From 2003 to 2007, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Nuclear Nonproliferation at State Department's Bureau of Nonproliferation. And before that, he served a lengthy stay in Ambassador Lugar's staff, Senator Lugar's staff. He should be in that. Yeah. Much he ever retired. And I think ambassadors always traveling around the world. Anyway, Andrew worked very closely with the senator in developing, promoting conference reduction. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Richard. We're very fortunate to have Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins here today, and as Richard said, she is the coordinator for threat reduction programs in the Department of State. And very impressive resume, as you heard. I think she probably does some, cooking of special meals at the White House as well. You've done just about everything else. So, Anyway, it's a new position. It's a new senior position in the State Department. So she's the first incumbent in this position that was created in the Obama administration and by Secretary Clinton. As Richard indicated, I think also we'll try a new format for these presentations today. Ambassador Jenkins and I will have a kind of interaction back and forth on some Q's and A's, and I'll ask some questions, and she'll respond as she sees fit, and perhaps I'll have some follow-up questions to those too. In addition to that, when we get, and following that, we'll open up the questions to the audience. And in addition to the questions that you might ask out here, we can field, since this is being live streamed, we can field questions, or I can field questions from those observing from afar who want to send in some questions to me. My email address is andsemm@aol.com. Pretty straightforward. andsemm@aol.com. So we may get some questions that I can get on the web, on the internet, as we go to open up questions on the floor. By way of just a very, very general statement at the outset, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program really began when the Cold War ended. And there was a situation in the states of the former Soviet Union, which collapsed at that point in time, that led to deep concerns about the vulnerability of weapons of mass destruction, the materials associated with the technology, equipment, as well as the expertise that was behind much of the Soviet programs of weapons of mass destruction. The initial response by the United States came in the form of the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program that was conceived in 1991, came into effect, into being in fiscal year 1992. The act was called the Soviet Nuclear Threat Reduction Act of 1991. The program, interestingly, was conceived after delegates from the former Soviet Union came to the United States and informed the administration, the Congress, and others of the risk and the dangers that were of unsecured and purely inventoried weapons of mass destruction programs in the former Soviet Union. This raised all kinds of alarm bells, and there was an effort to respond to that. It was very difficult. The Soviet Union, after all, had been our principal adversary for more than half a century. And I can tell you it was a rough start. The going wasn't very easy at the outset. It was a time in which the American people were looking for the peace dividend. They didn't want to get involved. The initial thought about how to deal with these unsecured weapons of mass destruction was initially thought of as foreign assistance, and you know how foreign assistance is very low on the totem pole of priorities, until it was reconceptualized as defense by other means by those who were working on this program. And then we got a turnaround on that. So the Nunn-Lugar program started in 1992 with about $400 million in the Defense Department. This was not new money, but it was money that the Defense Department already was being allocated and appropriated. So there are no new funds appropriated, but the Defense Department could use $400 million for the Cooperative Threat Program. The focus at that time was dubbed loose nukes, a term that's used with a lot of license. And the urgent need was to secure vulnerable nuclear weapons, destroy some of them, nuclear and chemical weapons, and to bring them back as necessary for safe storage in Russia, and then to establish safeguards against further proliferation of these weapons. The overall goal of the Nunn-Lugar program was and still remains to prevent weapons of mass destruction, the materials and technology associated with those weapons, as well as the expertise necessary to develop and use them, from getting into the hands of non-state actors, terrorists, criminal elements, other opportunists, as well as rogue states. It's based on the underlying logic that reducing the threat and keeping dangerous weapons away from these rogue elements, non-state actors and states, is simply too big and too complex for one state to handle. And the challenges are too great to handle, and the task to be successful had to involve collaboration and cooperation. hence the term Cooperative Threat Reduction. Since the 1990s, the CTR has evolved, and just to mention some very generic things, it has evolved, it's grown geographically. Originally, the non-Luger program focused on Russia and then Ukraine, and has grown over time to include a number and diversity of countries participating both as donors and as recipient countries. Donors offering their capital and expertise, and recipient countries allowing others to come in to deal with loose nukes and attendant problems. The program has grown in the amount of funds or funding dedicated to CTR from about the $400 million that I mentioned earlier to more than $1 billion per annum. It's grown in the number and diversity of the programs created over time to secure and prevent the spread of nuclear, chemical, biological, and radiological weapons. The CTR has also grown from what was originally a dire emergency to a more structured program, a structured set of programs that are still urgent and still serious. And it's also grown to include a number of U.S. agencies, federal agencies. Originally, it was focused on DoD, Department of Defense, but now obviously Department of State, Department of Energy are deeply involved as principal managers of the various CTR programs. But interestingly, it involves also other federal agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Agriculture, Health and Human Services, even Homeland Security. But it also involves international governmental organizations. The IAEA is part of this, UN Security Council 1540. And it also involves non-governmental organizations. The NTI, for example, has played some role in this, as well as the private sector. So the program has grown from its original inception back in the early 1990s, with focus principally on Russia, to a much more global effort. And we'll get into some of that, I think, during our Q&A. So with that, unless you'd like to say a few words?
No, I think you pretty much, thank you for that. Thank you, Richard, also. I think you pretty much outlined a lot of what I would have probably said at the beginning, which is that, you know, how CTR has grown and has expanded in the years since it started in 1992, from being a program run by DoD with DOE and State Department to one that has a lot more agencies, to one that has a lot more regions of focus, because the type of threat that we had faced in 1992 is not the same other type of threats we face today, which are much more global and which therefore require activities and programs that can address the type of threats we have today. So you have different programs, different agencies, different international organizations involved, different regions of focus, and different emphasis on the type of work that we do. And a lot of things that I do at State Department is really focus a lot of my attention on some of these new activities, trying to coordinate them, and also trying to do a lot internationally and trying to gain interest in the type of activities that we're doing in the United States, but also the kind of things we're doing with our allies and partners through a number of initiatives. And I'm focusing a lot on Africa and trying to increase the type of programs that we do in that region and other regions, and as we reach out to CTR, which has changed so much since 1992. So that pretty much outlines a lot of what I focus a lot of my attentions on is the new CTR, the evolution of CTR.
Okay, what I'm going to do is start this first part of the program. As I say, we'll go back and forth on some Q's and A's and some interaction, and then after a period, we'll open it up to the floor. Let me start out with some very general questions here to sort of provide the frame within which maybe you might want to follow up with some additional questions. And to some extent, we've already talked about this, but let's step back and let me ask this first question on sort of description of the CTR program itself. Can you start by giving us a sort of a kind of a brief description or overview of the CTR program as it's now configured, and where you believe it should be going and moving into the future? As you pointed out, 1991, 1992 is not the same as 2011. Times have changed. The program has changed with it. So you could give us kind of an overview, umbrella sort of statement.
I guess I could say, generally speaking, that the umbrella of CTR now is pretty much a wide umbrella, much wider umbrella. DoD, as you mentioned, focused a lot of its original attention in Russia and former Soviet Union because of 1992 and the events that followed in securing materials and and such in Russia, former Soviet Union. But now, for example, DoD is much more engaged in biosecurity, biosafety issues, disease surveillance issues outside Russia, former Soviet Union. You have DOE, Department of Energy, which is involved in a number of countries, over 90 countries that they're engaged in, working on radiological security, nuclear material security issues, border security issues. You have Department of State, which is also reaching out to areas in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa. So, the umbrella of CTR now is a lot more expansive, as we have been saying earlier, with agencies to some degree doing a lot of what they did before, but also doing a lot of new things. State Department, for example, still focusing a lot on the scientist engagement work, working with individuals, working with the human factor, still doing that, globally. But you also have new agencies, so the CTR umbrella is even wider because of that reason, because you have CDC engaged now, USDA, as you said, on animal health issues. So if you define the structure of CTR, you will see some similarities in the sense that some agencies are doing some similar things, but in different regions. You will find some departments doing different things than they've done before in the last few years since 1992. And also under that structure and umbrella, you'll see the new agencies who are engaged because they're doing such things as biosecurity, bioengagement. And so you need not only their expertise, but you also need the fact that some of these agencies and departments have been engaged in some of the regions that we want to go into, for example, Africa, Latin America. They've been there for a number of years, so we need their expertise and knowledge in those regions. So the structure is a lot wider in terms of what's happening.
One of the things I tried to get my arms around, not only in terms of preparation for this session, but also when I was back in the State Department and actually with Senator Lugar's office, is exactly what is CTR. It seems to me when we talk about how much funding is provided to this program, what do you include and what do you exclude? Because virtually all of our programs dealing with non-proliferation could conceivably be subsumed under the rubric of what is the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. You could get into some of the innovations that were created during the Bush administration, for example, is the Proliferation Security Initiative, the global initiative, to representative examples of what was created during the Bush administration. Is that part of CTR? Is there a dividing line between what you can include and what you can include? And I know that in the various discussions that probably take place at the G8, where you also represent the United States on these issues, on non-proliferation and global partnership, that there's some effort to try to identify the amount of funding that the United States contributes on an annual basis. But all that is dependent on what you include in what is part of the Cooperative Threat Reduction and what is not. So can you, it's hard to get my arms around exactly where the parameters are in this program. Can you maybe address that?
Thank you. That's a very good question, because it's one of the things we are always, I've been looking at is how do you define CTR today? Because you do look at things like the Global Initiative and Proliferation Security Initiative, and ask, are those included? Some would say no, it's not. Those are special type of programs that are not really the traditional type of CTR programs. So I think a lot of it will depend on who you ask. Currently, for example, the Global Partnership, we're not counting things that are done under PSI, for example, but we probably will in the future. But right now, CTR programs are the traditional programs, with new programs like export controls, which we see a lot more of that, of the biosecurity, bioengagement program. All of the programs are permissive, in which country, we're requested by a country, or a country asks, ask for assistance, or we promote assistance in a permissive environment. There are certain categories of activities that I would say for G8 global partnership purposes, which is one way of measuring what's CTR. There are certain things we have not been counting to date. So we haven't been counting global initiative activities. We haven't been counting proliferation security initiative activities. But we will be counting, for example, activities under UN Security Council Resolution 1540. And we will be counting biosecurity, bioengagement type activities, disease surveillance activities. So I guess the best definition would be that right now we don't. If you look at that as one way of measuring the G Global Partnership, we don't count those. But I think that as we look at this issue, there have been some internal discussions about how we define CTR. We've actually come up with a new definition, which I didn't bring with me, but it's a lot more expansive in how it defines what CTR is, so that it can encompass things like GIC and TMPSI.
And one of the reasons I asked that question, there is a kind of an evolving architecture of non-proliferation, nuclear and chemical bio, that exists. It's an architecture, I think, that that was not designed from a blueprint early on, and this is the way we deal with these difficult problems. But it's an architecture sort of that is in which there's units built into that over time in reaction to events like collapse of the Soviet Union, for example, or 9/11 and other things. So it's an architecture that is not particularly pretty necessarily, if you want to think of it as a structure, but it's a sort of attacking on different kinds of initiatives to deal with problems, usually in a reactive mode over time that the U.S. as well as other countries have made. And it's it's interesting to try to reconstruct how all those programs are put together, some of which are under the rubric of CTR and some of which are not. That's just a comment that I wanted to. If you've read the description of the program today in the both in the Partnership for Secure America and the Hudson Institute websites, there are a number of questions that are posed, and I want to just sort of use them at the outset also to talk to ask the ambassador a number of broad set of questions that are very similar to what's in your description of the program. And one of the questions that was there is, the CTR has been now sort of up and running for about almost 2 decades now, starting in the early 1990s. And the question that we are interested in is how can the CTR program continue to be effective in the 21st century? Just as we earlier noted, that times are not the same. Times have changed, issues have arisen, there are different players out there, different concerns, and this has evolved over time. So how has the CR, how can the CR adapt to these changes to continue to be effective? I think we all generally agree that it has been effective, although we might disagree on how much so. Does the CTR have a staying power? Can it stay with us and be reasonably effective in dealing with the larger issue of keeping dangerous items, dangerous weapons, dangerous materials out of the hands of dangerous people?
I think the fact that the threats have not gone away, and in fact that they've become more complex and more global, in itself is a driving force for continued work on CTR, because the desire to deal with these concerns and threats, and that the fact that they've become more complex in itself is a driving force for continued work in the future, because I seriously doubt anyone would feel any more secure by not having these programs and the threats themselves continue to evolve. I think that by continuing to be innovative in the way in which we address these threats is important. I think that ensuring that we have all the players at the table who have a stake in this is very important. I think continuing to reach out to our international partners to get them engaged is important. Very often I hear colleagues from the G8 Global Partnership and elsewhere who are interested in new types of doing different types of programs, whether it's biosecurity in different parts of the world they have not been engaged in to date. There's an interest in continuing to do these kind of things. So I think that we need to continue that momentum, in addition to trying to continue the funding to keep doing this work. So there is an interest to continue to address these threats. Having things like the Nuclear Security Summit, for example, also helps, because that gives such high-level attention to some of these issues on nuclear materials, for example, securing those materials. Continuing to have those things important. Having the national strategy on biosecurity, for example, that the U.S. released in 2009 is also important to provide the momentum that we need. Continue to push UN Security Council Resolution 1540, getting an extension on that is also important. So these are ways in which you can continue to momentum by bringing, not only having these activities continue and continue to address the threat and being innovative, but also to continue to bring in partners from donor countries, but also to continue to engage other countries who are not involved in these efforts, who we want to become involved, who we want to become partners, and help them understand why it's important to become involved and how these efforts can really help them and promote some of their security issues. So I think the momentum will continue. The threats aren't going anywhere. And if anything, like I said, they're becoming more complex.
I'll come back to some of that, and I want to ask a series of questions about funding later on,
Okay.
given the current environment and budget environment in Washington about the sustainability of these programs. But and you just mentioned donor countries and so on. It's interesting to me. Can we persuade? Is it possible for the United States to persuade Russia, for example, a long-term recipient of these programs, to partner with the United States, and with others for that matter, given their experience in the various CTR programs, really from the inception? Is it possible that we can get Russia, for example, to not only be a recipient but also be a partner in terms of lending its expertise, perhaps some of its resources, to achieve the same kinds of problems that we're talking about outside of the former Soviet Union, or maybe certainly in other states of the former Soviet Union? Is it possible Russia can play that kind of role?
I definitely think it's possible. I think it's also important that they do. I know that in the past years since the global partnership began, they have been funding some of the work that has been going on there in terms of the destruction of submarines and chemical weapons. But I think it's also important, as you said, to take advantage of the experience that is in Russia to help them become more of a donor country and not a recipient, even though we try to get away from the term donor and recipient as much as possible. But essentially, yes, we would like them to do a lot more. And I have heard sometimes, and I know I have one of my Russian colleagues in the audience who may want to say something later, but I mean, I have heard mumblings about this several times from some of my Russian colleagues about an interest in maybe doing some of that and getting engaged and being a donor in some of the kind of activities that we're doing in outside Russia, the former Soviet Union. So that's something that I know the U.S. is very interested in. I know that's something that a number of departments and agencies within the U.S. is interested in. We would be very much happy if they would use some of their expertise to help other regions to address some of the concerns that we have on these issues.
Have we actually made any efforts to do that?
We have. I mean, I have made efforts in some of my visits to talk with them about that and discuss this issue with them. So it's something that's on the table that we're talking about. There's some other issues that we want to resolve. I think the GA Global Partnership will be a good mechanism to have this kind of discussion with them. We're trying to resolve some other issues with the Global Partnership right now, but I think that that's something that definitely we can talk with them, particularly in that kind of a forum.
Another question I wanted to ask, again, that's I think on the description of the discussion we're having today, is what are some key lessons that are learned over the past nearly 2 decades of the CTR program, the non-Luger program, the CTR program? Do we, that obviously these programs should be we should be a learning component to them, and so that we make those adaptations to future programs based on what we've experienced with over the 17 or 18 years of this program. Are there some key lessons that sort of jump out at you and that are worth laying on the table, worth building upon in terms of different programs?
I guess a couple of things. One would be engagement and the importance of continued engagement with countries. These programs won't work unless you are working with individuals on a regular basis and willing to put the time and energy in to travel, to meet with individuals, to keep it going when there's problems, to work through them to the degree that you're able to. And that it's really a long-term thing, it's not really something that you can just do and just fix something and leave. You have to really be engaged in it for the long term, because there's always issues or problems that are going to come up. And I guess the other issue talking about long term is sustainability. I think that's very important. Right now we have funded a lot of very, very good work in Russia, former Soviet Union, and the issue now is how do we make sure that work is sustained, particularly as the U.S. and other countries decide to start working in other parts of the world. You want to make sure that the work that you have done already continues there and is sustainable. And that shows the importance of engaging individuals in developing a culture of responsibility for the kind of work that we're at security and have a security culture in the long term. But sustainability is also important, and that'll be very important as we go into different regions of the world. As we go into other regions, to not only go in there with ideas and ways in which to do things, but to help them develop the capacity so that the work that we're doing could be sustained in the future, so that we don't feel we have to be there forever, so that we can go and improve security at facilities and help with disease surveillance issues and then know that there's a culture there that will pick that up and do that in the future and own that issue and buy into that issue so that it will be sustained for the long run.
Questions are coming in. I hear the blinking on here. Oh yes, there's about 3 questions. It's sort of related to this point, Bonnie. I was wondering if you could identify some of the key problems, some of the key obstacles that we're confronting with the continuation of the CTR program, not just in Russia, but generally speaking, as we're trying to draw this frame around this program, what are some of the key obstacles or problems that we haven't encountered? I know you have to get the cooperation, obviously, of the host government. Somebody just asked before we started this program whether we're still in touch with Libyan scientists in the engagement redirection program in Libya. Well, it's very difficult to do it under current circumstances. So there are some real problems of entree and access, things like that. But could you just maybe talk very generally about some problems and challenges that we're now facing as we go forward with some of these programs?
Oh, well, I guess the most obvious would be the funding issue, and I guess we're going to talk about that a little later, is, you have to have the funding to do this work. So that's obviously one very important issue. The other one is, as you said, there's political issues. You don't know when something may crop up to slow things down. You may be in the process of really developing a program. You have your folks in there, you're working on it, and then a political situation that has nothing to do with what we're doing may crop up, and that may cause everything to stall. And that has its implications on funding and success and things like that. But there's also challenges as we go into different regions. Different countries have different perceptions of threat. So and different security issues, and their priority of security issues may not mesh with the same that we have. So not so much as a problem as much as it's something that we have to learn to work with and work around. And for example, if you're going into a region where their issue is human trafficking and small arms, how do you work with them so that you help them understand, well, trafficking is also important in our respect too, in terms of nuclear material or securing radiological material, just securing borders in general, to make sure that the same borders that you make sure that people with can transit illicit material are also the same ones that you want to secure so that you can prevent human trafficking. So it's learning how to adjust to different threat perceptions, different security concerns, different levels of security concerns, which is different from I think we had in the past. So I think incapacity is a big one. The fact that these are all great programs, but if countries don't have the capacity to do the programs, they're not going to want to be interested in doing it, which is logical. So once again, I guess you could look at it as a problem, but I look at it more of a challenge in ways in which we have to try to deal with some of these things. So these are all things I think as we go into different regions, different parts of the world, these are problems or challenges that are different from what we had in the past, but still have to be dealt with.
Yeah, I do know, just by way of a small comment, that I do at the early stages of the non-Luger program in the 90s, when it was difficult to launch the program, even once it was approved by the Congress and the administration. The administration, by the way, under H.W. Bush, very much resisted the program at the outset, as did many members of Congress. So the problem internally here in the United States launching the non-Luger program. But once it was launched, there was the problems that we faced, particularly with Russia, about access, about taxes on materials coming into, equipment coming into Russia, issues of liability, privileges and immunities of personnel coming in working on these programs in Russia and elsewhere. And I do remember, just again by way of a quick comment, meeting with delegations from Russia and Ukraine while in the Senate, and they would come over and say, these are great programs, why don't you just let us implement them? Give us the money, we'll implement them, we'll take care of it. And that obviously did not fly very well. So there's those kinds of problems amongst others that we're facing early on. Mm-hmm. And I guess to some extent we might still face problems of access, obviously, still in
So I think obviously one of the big differences, I think there are several differences and several lessons I think that I learned from all those experiences, is that a lot of programs we're doing now are smaller programs. I mean, a lot of programs in Russia were large scale, big programs, and what you're seeing today is a lot smaller programs, a lot more diffuse and diverse, which causes its own challenges in terms of coordination and who's doing what, not just within the U.S. but internationally. but it also means that that the challenges are different, and you don't have the big conglomerate, huge programs where it was just a different type of thing that you had to organize and arrange beforehand. So.
I'm going to jump to the Global Partnership, which is a program that was created under the auspices of the G8 in 2002. You also represent the United States State Department, U.S. at the G8 Global Partnership Working Group. That's what it was
Right.
called. It's still called that. And this was the program focusing primarily at the outset on Russia and then Ukraine later on, but principally on the former states of the Soviet Union. The Global Partnership was a 10-year program. It's sometimes called 10 plus 10. That is to say, the U.S. would pledge $10 billion. Other countries would pledge $10 billion over a 10-year period, starting in 1992. The partnership, as we know it, I'm sorry, 2002. What did I say?
1990.
Oh, 2002. So if you, my arithmetic's not very good. So if you add 10 years on to 2002, it brings up to 2012, when the Global Partnership is scheduled to expire, unless it's extended. And it was not extended at the last G8 meeting in Canada, which is where it originally was created at Kananaskis in 2002. Now, France chairs the G8 next year.
This year.
This year, that's right, this year. We chair, the U.S. chairs it in 2012. What are the prospects that either this year or next year that there will be a decision to extend the Global Partnership for another increment of time, conceivably 10 years, another 10 years, with perhaps similar kinds of commitments of fundings or pledges of funding that the original one we're operating under now? What's the prospect, and what is the administration game plan on this? Do we have what are our objectives? How are we going to pursue this effort? I know that this is a discussion that's been taking place in the G8 for some time, and there is sentiment among some of the members, not necessarily all, to extend the Global Partnership. Can you just maybe address that?
Oh yes, thanks. I think the prospects are very positive for extension. I mean, I can't say for sure, because we don't know. But I would say that I think that there is, and it was recognized in Muskoka last year, that the threat does exist. It's going to exist for a long time, and we need to work together to address those threats. And I know France, as chair right now, is very committed to an extension of the G8 Global Partnership. The issue again is going to be funding. I mean, that's the one that is always, not just in the U.S. but internationally as well. That's the sticky point. But there are several of the G8 who are committed to extending, and also several of the non-G8 members who are part of the partnership who are very committed. I mean, everyone I've spoken with, and I've spoken to quite a few of the other 18 countries, do want to continue the global partnership. Some have said they're going to continue funding the work, whether there's a GP or not. I think that, now that we have France and they're committed to it, of course, we just started this process last year when Canada was chair. We figured it'd be good to start the process ahead of time, give countries a chance to get their budgets in line and plan ahead. But also because Canada was the chair in 2002 when it was started, would be momentous for them to do it last year. So we continue to work closely with France on this. We'll continue to work closely with our G8 partners on this. There's several meetings that are upcoming to have more in-depth discussion. We're working on the assessment that was requested last year to look at potential future areas of funding in nuclear and radiological security, biosecurity, scientist engagement, and 1540 implementation. So I think, without knowing for sure, I'd say the prospects are very positive, and it's something we're just working very hard on to try to achieve this year. Next year, of course, is another option, another possibility, but if we could get it this year, that'd be great. Yeah.
You mentioned 1540 as something that the Global Partnership and CTR is interested in. Is it possible that the Global Partnership, one of the advantages as I see it, maybe you want to talk about this, is that it doesn't have a bureaucracy, it's not institutionalized. It works, and the chairmanship, if you will, revolves every year depending on who's hosting the G8 at any one time. And there's funds. You actually have resources that countries have pledged that can do things with respect to prevention of preventing bad people from getting hold of nuclear weapons and chemical and biological materials and so forth. Is there any possibility that the G8 would consider funding programs that have the same kinds of objectives as the G8, like, for example, UN Security Council 1540, or even funding the International Atomic Energy Agency's nuclear security program? That is to say, set aside and says, well, we think that these programs are consistent with the original goals of the global partnership. Why don't we provide some stimulus funding, if you will, for these programs? So is it possible to branch out into sort of non-country specific programs?
Yes and yes.
Good.
Yes and yes. One, because 1540 was recognized as one of the 4 areas that would be that countries would get credit for in the future, and also because we've been saying, if you're funding work in the IAEA Nuclear Security Fund, that should be counted. So the thing is, when G8 was started, it was decided at the very beginning that the first funding would be toward Russia and former Soviet Union. And so that's what all of we've been counting. So anything else a country has been doing outside Russia, they, one, have not been counting toward their G8 Global Partnership commitment. Not that they haven't been doing it, they haven't been counting it. So there's a lot, for example, the U.S. is doing, Japan is doing, the European Union is doing, Canada is doing, the U.K. are doing. They're doing work outside Russia that they're not counting. There's also a lot of money that countries are putting toward the IAEA Nuclear Security Fund that they're going to continue to do in the future, that they're going to continue to do 1540 after 2012, that they're not counting right now toward their global partnership. So the idea is all this work and all this money that's going toward these efforts, which are all efforts that are not only CTR program type efforts, but efforts to prevent WMD terrorism, they should all be counted. It was just there was a decision at the beginning not to count those, but in an extended global partnership, all of that work could be counted toward a country's commitment. So that's why I said all those 4 areas that I mentioned that countries are not counting now, and it would be anywhere in the world, no matter where it happens, whether it's Russia, former Soviet Union, anywhere they're doing that kind of work should be counted toward their commitments. And a number of countries, even 1 or 2 that had a problem with funding, have said, we are going to continue this work in the future. We're going to continue to fund IAEA Nuclear Security Fund. We're going to do 1540. So a lot of it's helping these countries understand that you're going to be doing the things that would be encountered toward a global partnership anyway. And so helping countries understand how that whole thing works is important.
Are there programs, I know there are programs, but maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the programs where we actually work with other donor states, if you will. That is to say, we collaborate with the UK or with Canada in terms of funding, providing the expertise in a single project abroad where we sort of combine our resources and the expertise to work in either building a chemical weapons destruction facility or whatever it may be in Russia. And rather than simply everything being bilateral, it truly is, in some ways, by joint programs, we could truly add the multilateral component to it. Are there some examples you can mention of?
Well, some of the programs that the Department of Energy does, they reach out and have joint funding from a number of countries. There's something called the Nuclear Smuggling Outreach Initiative at the Department of State, which is they go to different countries and have what they call a plan for all the things the country would need to secure their nuclear material and also to ensure that there could be no smuggling of nuclear material. And then after they have a country plan, they go out and get donations from different countries. And several countries from the G8 Global Partnership will fund the work of one particular country. So that's happening in a lot of different places, in a number of the countries that are already a part of G8. They're doing these kind of joint programs. And we actually, there's a report that the G8 did that actually lists some of the programs that have more, not just bilateral, multilateral support. So these things are going on, but we'd like to make that happen even more in the future. I mean, what we'd like the G8 to be is a real coordinating function, a real coordinating mechanism, to be a place where we do coordinate so many of these what are going to be smaller programs around the world. And if you have 23 countries, hopefully more in the future, join this, you have a mechanism that exists already to do that. And I know the French are interested in that they're calling it an overarching architecture, which GP would be a place where it would be the architecture for all of these programs with 1540, nuclear security, biosecurity, nuclear security fund, whatever it is, would be a coordinating mechanism for all.
Speaking of, again, the global partnership and participating countries on the donor side, as you mentioned, there are about 23, 24, including the European Union, who are offering their resources into these programs. And I think this is a good thing. Is it possible that other donors might want to step up to the plate? That donors that have also have some interest in these programs and also have a lot of foreign exchange. Let me just mention two: Saudi Arabia and the People's Republic of China, who themselves would seem to have some interest in the global efforts to stem the spread of weapons of mass destruction and materials and equipment and so forth. Is it possible that countries of that characterization would also want to jump in? And have we tried to get, have we solicited their participation?
I would say that yes. One of the things we want to do in the future of the GP is to increase membership. And that's one of the things that was mentioned last year in Muskoka in Canada as one of the things that GP would look at in the future. So we are interested in bringing in more countries. China has been mentioned by several partners as potential for joining. So that would be that is something that we want to do. I know there has been just very little outreach because we haven't yet as a G8 really grappled with that yet because we've been working on extension. But I know France is interested in it. I know the U.S. is interested in it, and Canada was last year. So, that is something that's going to happen. We've already had some good discussions with Kazakhstan to join. And so we do want to reach out to China. We want to reach out to regions in Africa. We want more countries in Asia, Latin America. So that's something that we're very interested in doing. There's also a number of countries who are part of the Nuclear Security Summit. I mean, those countries who we know are going to be either are already spending funds on nuclear security, radiological security issues, that, we know that they would be good partners. So then it's just a matter of not even convincing them to spend money. You're already doing something. You could be a part of this, and by being a part of the GP, they're part of the structure and part of the mechanism, and we can help understand what countries are funding and where they're funding and how much, and all those beneficial efforts. So yes, we are interested in. And China has been mentioned several times as potential.
Glad to hear that. I want to spend a little time now on two other broad issues, on the funding issue that I mentioned before, and also on the organization, the arrangement that is set up to manage our CTR program. On the first area, funding, as I mentioned, I think, and you mentioned also, that when you add up all the programs, however you define what's in the CTR, it comes up to more than $1 billion per year that the United States is kicking into these various programs. A sum that seems quite large, although it's very puny when compared to the size of the government, the budget, for example. But when you consider the fact that these issues, that is, say, efforts to prevent the spread of weapons of mass destruction, particularly getting into the wrong hands, it's a very small amount that the U.S. is actually forking up. More than any other country, presumably, but it's still a small amount given the magnitude and the currency of the problem. It's not always been easy, as I understand the CTR program, to convince critics that the money is well spent, or that it's basically worth it. So let me ask a couple questions on the funding side of, because basically I've always followed the logic of a simple syllogism. That is to say, money equals program, program equals policy, therefore money equals policy. Oftentimes the money that drives the policy. Couple questions. First address the magnitude, the question of how much is really in the coffers of these programs, how much we contribute, and who is spending it, and where are these funds spent on balance.
Who's spinning it is DOE, state, DOD, a lot of the same agencies. We're providing some funds to other agencies to help with biosecurity issues, like to the USDA and HHS to help us with some of the bio issues. So in terms of who's spinning, it's pretty much the same agencies who are working the issues, but also, like I said, spinning them in different ways, in different on different issues, and different parts of the world. So that's pretty much who's spinning it. And as far as the magnitude, yes, it's a lot of work. And when you start thinking about globally, doing all the things we need to do, whether it's export control, biosecurity, radiological security, places in the world we haven't even touched, and places of the world we can't touch because we don't have the funding to do it. And that it's a large problem. And that's why we also need a lot of assistance from our partners in the G8 and other countries to help with this issue, not only securing their own material and making sure things domestically are going well, but to help us in regions of the world that don't have the capacity to do the things that are needed, so that you don't have a lot of weak links in the chain. So with all the money that we're spending, there's still large parts that we can't get to, and just large parts of the world that we can't really help build capacity because we don't have the funding to do it. And so that's why it's so important that we have these G8 Global Partnership and those kind of things, that we can help deal with the global problems by having other countries contribute.
As I recall, it was not always easy to get Congress to agree to some of these fundings, even though the numbers, the amount has increased over
Yeah,
time.
and I think, sometimes we're not very good at telling our story. I think, in the government, we're so busy taking care of the problem and trying to take care of the next problem that we often don't do a good job of saying the success stories of what we are accomplishing. So I think we need to do a better job of that, of talking about all the good work we're doing in Southeast Asia, the work that we're doing in Africa, the work that we're doing around the globe, what we've done so far. All the radiological security work we've done, the radiation detector machines we've put in borders, the training we've done on licensing and export controls. I mean, we don't do a good job of that. We need to do better.
Yeah, I know Senator Lugar always, you want to talk about Senator Lugar's scorecard.
Yeah, Senator Lugar has a great scorecard
yes,
on his
thank
website where he actually cites all the work that's been done in the former Soviet Union in terms of what's been destroyed in terms of missiles and nuclear weapons and silos, and it actually counts it. And so it's nice color and it has all the numbers, and that's a very concrete way of showing it. But there's so much that's done that's hard to just put numbers to, and I think that's a challenge when you're training scientists and you're developing a culture of responsibility, a culture of safety, of scientists understanding the importance of securing this, the importance of having secure facilities. It's hard to put numbers to that, and I think that's a challenge that we have, particularly as you get away from these large projects where you can count things you cut, to the kind of projects where you're actually working in individuals. But when you travel, I was in Africa a couple of weeks ago. When you travel and you meet people and you talk with them, you see and you can hear the difference. But you can't put a number to that, and so how do you, and that's one of the challenges, how do you measure these new types of programs when they're not the same as they were before, when they're a lot more small programs, individual programs. But you can still count, if you secure a bio lab, you can see that. You can take a picture. Okay, this did not have and it's the same way we did with nuclear materials. You can look and see a secure facility that was not secure before. You can see that. But it's the other stuff that's the intangible part, but that still needs the funding, because it's the individuals that have the skills to build those things. So if you can deal with the individuals, you have a lot to solve right there.
One of the, going back to global partnership for just a moment, I think if you really want to understand some aspects of the global partnership and the changes that have taken place and the success of the programs that are underway, the global partnership annual report has an annex to it, and the annex sort of lists all the programs that are underway, that are being funded, that have been completed, and so forth. And there's some useful metrics there in descriptive form. It's usually a very thick thick, thick annex because it includes not just what the United States is doing, but what all the other donor countries.
And even there, I've found that I've traveled to a number of donor countries, and even they're not putting everything. Because sometimes I was in one country and I showed them the annex, and different parts of government put things together. So the individual I was talking to looked at the annex and they saw they had like just 3 lines, and they said, "This is not representative of all the work we're doing. We're doing so much more, and so we need to make sure the annex itself is really reflective, but also when we start counting all this other work, it'll even be more reflective."
One more question on funding, and that is the question, I think I might have alluded to it earlier, and that is that given the current budget environment in Washington, and that most programs are not sacrosanct anymore, that they're on the potential chopping block for cuts. Do you have some sense of how vulnerable the CTR programs that the U.S. needs to fund to continue sustainability and to deal with new areas and new problems, what the problems are that we're likely to face?
Well, I mean, it's a budget fight, so I mean, like any budget fight, it's hard to know how vulnerable you are. You just kind of keep fighting. I know that one of my concerns is the recent potential cuts to DOE's programs for some of the things that they need to do to fulfill the 4-year effort to secure all vulnerable nuclear materials. So, I'm hoping that is resolved in a very positive way, so that there are not significant cuts there. But you fight the fight. I mean, it's an issue that is very important. We've had presidents, not just President Obama, but prior presidents saying how important it is on the issue of nuclear terrorism and how we need to combat that. And commissions have talked about the concerns about biosecurity and bioterrorism. So the threat is out there. We need to keep ensuring that we have the funds to address these threats. Particularly as we ask other countries to dedicate funds to this, we have to be sure that we're still very much doing it ourselves.
I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll throw it open because the time is fleeting by. The question I had a series of questions about organization, but you are the coordinator for threat reduction programs in the Department of State, but we don't have a overall coordinator for all the programs, as we mentioned, that DOE, Department of State, HHS, Agriculture, and others are involved in. And whether or not this would be a good thing or not, but there's been a lot of commentary about the fact that how do you pull all these programs together in such a way that there's good synergy, that there's not so much overlap and fragmentation. We see that in the way in which Congress, various different appropriations committees appropriates in their own way for each of these separate programs, and so that the parts don't always necessarily mesh in a way that maximizes their benefit. Let me just ask the simple question: why is there no overall coordinator? You become the first coordinator in the State Department.
I guess there's 2 answers. I think we have good leadership at the White House. We have Gary Seymour, who is the coordinator for arms control, weapons of mass destruction. We have Laura Holgate, who also is there and plays a very vital role in helping to ensure that our programs are coordinated. And she's the senior director of WMD terrorism and threat reduction. But in addition to them, even though I'm the State Department coordinator, I also to some degree play a different role. For example, particularly regarding the international side, I'm very insistent on whenever I travel to Africa, for example, or someplace else, I ensure that I have prepared with me a delegation that's representative of the different agencies in the government who are involved, and that when I promote programs, I don't promote just state programs, I promote all the government programs in order to make sure that when we go overseas and talk about what the U.S. wants to do, they have a good understanding of the U.S. government as a whole to work these things, because one thing I promote very much is a whole of government approach in the way in which we do our activities. But also within the U.S., I mean, I host a number of interagency meetings focusing on Africa, starting to do some on Latin America, to bring around the table a large understanding of what different agencies are planning to do, what different agencies are doing, so that when we have these trips and I go overseas, we can have a whole of government approach as we do things. And also through the GA Global Partnership is also a mechanism in which we have been working within the U.S. government with all the agencies involved. The bio area is very well coordinated with Ben Picho at the White House, and also is part of the work that we're doing in the GA Global Partnership. And then there's also mechanisms. I mean, you can have one or two people at the top that's kind of coordinating, but it's so what we do is so diverse and so large that it's important to also have different mechanisms within the government itself. We have the Export Control Program called XPIS, which is run out of the State Department, which is an interagency coordination group of all agencies that work on export control and border security. We have a huge coordinating group for the Global Initiative. We have a coordinating group for the PSI. We have a coordinating group for 1540. So even within the different areas, you have the interagency getting together and focusing, and then you have an understanding of, because you have an understanding what everybody's doing, because in each of these meetings you have people that work on different issues. So even within the government, you have a lot of coordination. There's a lot of coordination between DoD and State Department on the bio issues. Working in Africa, for example, they do joint visits together. And I was in Africa 2 weeks ago. I had some DoD folks with me talking about some of the programs we want to do over there. So there's different ways you can coordinate. I think you have the White House leadership. I'm doing what I do in terms of the international, in terms of also domestic. But then you also have a number of other activities that are being coordinated within the government.
All right. Well, I think we'll now move to questions from you all, and as well as questions that I see have come in trickling in, one or two questions so far on the website, on my email address. So why don't we open the floor questions? You can pick up from what we've discussed or go into new territories. And there'll be a microphone coming around right over here. Okay. And please identify who you are and who you represent and your question. Keep them short, please.
Judith Mandel. I work for URS Corporation, one of the citric integrating contractors who actually implement some of the CPR programs for DoD, DOE, and state. And my question is, many of the programs seem to have grown up in response to current events or immediate issues. Going forward, is there any effort to reassess what the threat is and do a kind of comprehensive evaluation of what might be needed, whether that is more on border control, bio, more on the nuclear? So it's not just programs going forward, but really focusing on what are the new and upcoming.
There are, I guess for that I would say there are numerous threats assessments that are done on a regular basis. There's two ways. Each one of the programs usually have a threat assessment done on a regular basis. They get threat briefings regularly. Sometimes they'll have an annual one where they will actually have the intel come and talk about the threats and rank countries based on a threat assessment. And then that's how programs are decided in terms of where the funding is going to go. So whereas in the early days of CTR, it was all focused on Russia, former Soviet Union, because that was the threat. Now, because things were much more global, we will have the intelligence community give us an assessment of where the threats are. And that's sometimes done based by the export control interagency group will have a threat assessment, for example. So that will help decide where funding should be spent. We also have, when I do my regional meetings, we sometimes have a threat assessment of the region in general, which will help inform those who are doing the programmatic side decide where their funding should go. And that helps to decide how we spend our funds in this very diverse environment where threats are a lot more imminent than just from one country or one region.
Paul? Oh, up front here.
Thank you. Thanks both Bonnie and Andy for very nice Q&A. You've covered almost all that I think I've thought about throughout the discussion. I had one major question, I guess, and that is the National Academy of Sciences report probably 3 years ago now, maybe, called euphemistically called CTR 2.0, in which they were. It was I thought, a very thoughtful analysis in which they were pretty critical in a number of ways of what cooperative threat reduction had done in the past. They criticized leadership, U.S. government leadership thereof, particularly in the Department of Defense. They criticized public engagement and transparency. That in fact, there really wasn't enough sort of public processing and public outreach and engagement. And they also criticized programs on sustainability, in which we pop into a weapon site, for example, put security on it for a year or two, and then leave, and then don't really evaluate the longer term issues about whether the equipment's maintained, the training is maintained, and the like. A lot of this, I'm sure, was focused on the former Soviet Union and Russia, because that's where CTR actually was focused the first 15 years or so. I'm wondering, from your perspective, Bonnie, and Andy too, if you'd like, have we met some of the criticisms now of the CTR, the National Academy CTR 2.0 report? Is there better leadership of CTR over in Fort Belvoir in particular? Is there more transparency now? For example, is the CTR website usable? Is there better public response to press questions to CTR, which there was never under the prior administration? And is there better intergovernmental, interagency cooperation that you've partly already answered, I think, and you asked, Andy? Thank you.
I guess I'll say a couple of things. Over Belvoir, we have Ken Myers there, as you know, who, as you know, worked for Luker for a number of years.
Sat next to me.
Yeah. So he has a lot of background and knowledge on these issues, as you know, and I find him very accessible. I talk to him a lot, and also to the folks over at DoD, Andy Weber, for example. So, I can handle men. I know them well. So I think that, my impression is the leadership is good. You have people who've been working on these issues for a long time. And so my assessment is I work well with them, and I think they do a good job. As far as public transparency and outreach, I can say that I host a number of meetings with NGOs, and I've been a couple of people here who actually sat in a couple of those meetings, doing outreach with them, trying to find out, not only trying to get a better understanding of what we're doing in the government, but also to get a better understanding of what the NGO world is doing. I used to, as you know, I was at the Ford Foundation. I funded a lot of organizations, so I have very good contacts with them, and I have my colleague Erin Harbaugh here from State Department, who also does a lot of outreach to NGOs and think tanks and research institutes. So we're trying to increase our outreach to NGOs. I know 1540 does a great job with NGOs, both here and internationally. So we have a lot of programs that are going on with NGOs, conferences that we're doing at State Department, for example, and my meetings that I have, where I have both interagency and NGOs in the room talking to each other. Sustainability, I mentioned that's a very important issue. I know that folks are thinking about it a lot, not just in the U.S., but internationally. Had a good colleague from Canada here last week, and he was talking a lot about how they're thinking about sustainability, because it's very important. And like I said, because we're in this point of transition where, okay, we put a lot of money into Russia, now we want to start working in different regions. How do we make sure that we are continuing to work, that our efforts continue in Russia, and we make sure that we do things right from the very beginning in different regions to ensure the sustainability there as well in the future. One thing I'm actually doing right now is and a couple of folks here know about that, is I'm actually trying to put together a CTR handbook, which is going to list all of the programs that DoD, DOS, and DOE are doing on CTR. And I've actually started gathering a lot of that information. And hopefully we can get that on a CD, and that's what we'd like to do. And then, of course, we'd like to also have, HHS and what they're doing. Ideally, which is something I can't put together, we would have one that's NGO, that'd be a compendium on the NGO side that talks about all the stuff the NGOs are doing on CTR efforts. And so we would have a good understanding of what we're doing, both in the government and outside of government, on CTR as a government. Because to me, that also defines full government approach. It's what the government as a whole, which in my view can incorporate some of the stuff the NGOs are doing, because they help support the government. Interagency coordination, I think I mentioned about already. I fostered it as much as I can. This afternoon, I have 3 hours of interagency meetings I'm having So I try to do that as much as I can because particularly if we're going to have a whole of government approach, we have to understand what everybody's doing and also try to strategize and prioritize our efforts.
I might just add a few things, Paul. I think that you asked the questions, and for both of us, I won't say much, but Bonnie mentioned the handbook possibility. I do know that the Canadians have put a marvelous thick brochure out on this, which I think it's on a year-to-year basis, so they keep talking about their updates of the programs. I think maybe others might do the same thing as well. When I was doing the Global Partnership Program, every year before the G8 met, I called in a lot of individuals whom I thought or knew had an interest in the Global Partnership and asked me, what would you like to see us do? And some of that, I think, was translated into what we actually ended up doing, but it was a small effort to solicit viewpoints that might not otherwise have been generated out of the bureaucracy. The sustainability argument, I think, is a legitimate one. It's a very important one. Used to be stop and start programs, never effective. I think it's a criticism that could be made to foreign policy in general, as many countries have criticized the United States in the past for going in and helping solve a problem and then walking away from it, and the thing begins to fester and so on. So it's a generic problem, I think, that translates across issue areas. Website I can't comment on, but I do know that Dick Lugar has a very active website in terms of information about the success of the scorecard that we mentioned before. That is very, very helpful. But obviously, all these areas can be improved. And I think I agree with you.
Yeah, I would love to have a website. That'd be great. You know, it's got to get the manpower.
Yes, right here, middle.
Milton Honig, which area of the CTR program now receives the greatest funding? I'm just counting a word count. It sounds like biosecurity, but I'm not sure that's the case. So,
Not wanting to speak out of turn without having the numbers right in front of me. I mean, I do have some numbers, but rather than go through this, biosecurity is getting quite a bit of funding. It's getting a lot of funding in DoD now. It's a lot of the work that we do at State Department is bio. Of course, DOE is doing the nuclear work. But a lot of the DoD, a lot of DOS is bio. We also have we have a bio engagement program. We also have a chemical engagement program and nuclear engagement program. But the bio is the bulk of the money, I think. And DoD still does work in Russia and finishing up work in Russia and former Soviet Union, but it has gotten a big plus up for bio work. So without the numbers in front of me, I would say the bio has quite a bit of funding. I'm not going to say it's more, but I would say it's quite a bit.
I'm going to ask one of the questions that came across, the very first question that came across on the internet. It's a very basic question, Ambassador. Where and how is Pakistan included in the CTR effort? Are there limitations to what CTR can do without host government cooperation?
Actually, there is work going on in Pakistan. The bio engagement program is working in Pakistan with doing engaging scientists there, and they've been working there for a few years. And also DoD is now engaged in Pakistan as well. So there is efforts. I mean, of course, it's taken a while to get us to the point where we can have these scientist engagements with them, and a lot on the bio side, of course. But we are in there doing work, and we have people from state and DoD that go there on a regular basis, and we have individuals from Pakistan who we fund to go to conferences and things like that to work. So we are involved in Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Okay. Second part of that question was, are there problems? I don't have it here on my screen now, but are there problems that we confront in countries that are less reluctant? Well, obviously.
Okay, I guess the biggest problem is they're reluctant. Well, some of them are reluctant because, like I said, capacity. We'll go with our our menu of activities, and sometimes we come in with too many, so we've learned to prioritize our list of activities that we can do for each country. But a lot of it's capacity, and they will decide what from our list of menus of CTR activities they're interested in, if any. You also have to deal with the fact that, like I said, not every country sees threats the same way or measures threats the same way or has the same priority list. So that's one of the other problems that we face as we go forward.
Yeah. Additional questions? Back in the middle here.
Steve Huntsman from Equilibrium. I'd like to frame my question in the context of technology performance. So, in a lot of the FMAs, you get U.S. giving to a lot of the information get back back very, and especially given that high capital required. How would you value the relative funding infrastructure for individual? How do you value that capital?
Yeah, that's a little bit of what I was talking about earlier. I mean, you have to have both. For example, you have to, if you're going to put funding into securing a laboratory, a biolab, that's nice to secure the lab, but you also have to develop within the individuals in the lab a security culture for why it's important to do that. I mean, it sounds simple, but you have to ensure that you have both. You have to work with the people, and you have to work with the other part, the infrastructure. That's easier, of course, to measure. And in that way, we've done a lot of good work with. And historically, I mean, CTR, you have, as I said, State Department has been a lot more focused on the individuals. DoD and DOE have focused. DoD particularly focused a lot more on the infrastructure. DOE doing a little of both. But yes, it is like I said, it's hard to measure that, but you have to do it, and we're still working on the best way to measure that. We have we have a couple of labs and folks are looking at the issue and figuring out good ways to do it. We have I think a National Academy study coming out soon, I think, on metrics. So we have some folks out there that are focusing on this because we know it's important when you go to the Hill and you want to get funding, you need to be able to explain why it's important. Like I said, we can cart up to the Hill a bunch of folks who we've worked with who can all say how much they've been affected by it, and we see it. We see, speaking of Pakistan, for example, helping them to establish their own biological associations of individual and scientists. Same thing in Africa. And you see that they take on the responsibility, they take it on, they teach it themselves to other colleagues. So you see it happening. But measuring it measuring it in the traditional way is the problem. I think what we need is new ways of measuring. That is not what we used to do. When we used to just measure structures and submarines and missiles. You have to measure it differently. And I think that's what we're grappling with now.
I add one footnote to that. Many of these programs, or some of these programs at least, involved training programs. Training programs and workshops to develop, for example, try to help develop a security culture, if you will, in some of these facilities and some of these places, so that there are these contacts with the trainers and those who are being trained or exposed to new ways of securing buildings and securing materials and so forth. And these centers of excellence that have sort of emerging out of the Nuclear Security Summit and so forth are also examples where there are these kind of person-to-person contacts that may have lasting impact, much like the IMET program and military training program and so forth. Question on the internet here very quickly, which is interesting. I hadn't thought about it. Has anyone been thinking about how to carry out CTR activities in unrecognized but de facto states such as Transnistria and Nagorno-Karabakh? Interesting question.
I'm not aware of a focus or a study on that. I think that's important. I think that's important to consider how we would do something like that there. But that would be very challenging to actually try to carry it out there.
Question is,
Yeah.
who would you deal with? I mean, who would
Yeah,
you,
I mean that's I mean you have to have I mean like I said, these are permissive programs where you go into a country and you're dealing with a structure and a government that's actually trying to carry things out at least to the degree possible. So when you don't have that, that's an obvious challenge. Yeah.
Question is,
Yeah.
who would you deal with in eastern Libya right now? If you had a
Well, yeah,
problem?
yeah, right.
Yes, over here.
Yeah, Doug Birch, Associated Press. Eastern Libya is exactly what's on my mind right now. I mean, the State Department has had an engagement program with Libyan scientists since about 2004. What's the state of that program now, given the unrest in that country, and how are you going to try to sustain it and restart it once the unrest is over?
Well, we were having some efforts to restart it before everything started to fall apart in Libya. There were some State Department contacts and some efforts to restart the program. Right now, I mean, I know they're having some meetings on it. Right, I mean, obviously, we have to wait until the situation is better for us to actually do some work there. But the interest is still there, and I know that we had made some efforts, and we thought that we were going to make some more efforts recently, not too long before the situation changed in Libya. So when things, hopefully when things get stable again, we can re-engage.
Any other questions? Yeah, over here.
Arta Parema, State Department. You've mentioned your travels to Africa and Latin America and some of the work that is going there. Could you talk a little bit about the work that's being done in Northeast Asia?
Most of the work, we have, there's efforts with Japan, Korea. They are developing these centers of excellence that you mentioned. China also developing work on center of excellence. So there is activity right now in those regions to work on definitely the nuclear radiological issues, but other issues as well. So there's a lot of engagement there.
I think it would be prudent to for the administration and all parties involved to kind of spring load programs for North Korea, because when that transforms, when that changes, you'll have a rich environment in which to certainly in terms of scientist engagement programs and redirection and so forth.
Well, as you know, I mean, we were there before. We were asked to leave, and they were doing a lot of the type of activities that trying to get rid of the nuclear weapons infrastructure and things like that. So I mean, there's obviously work that could be done in North Korea, assuming that the situation is allowable for it.
Still got to get visas to get into the country.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Who wants to cap it off? Right back here.
Yep. Jung Min Kang, South Korean nuclear analyst and currently visiting scholar at the Science Johnson
Speak a little louder, please.
visiting scholar at Science Johns Hopkins. And my question was just as you mentioned that about the North Korean nuclear issues. So is your State Department CTR program considering to expand its scope to include the North Korean nuclear weapons issues?
Well, right now we are not, because like I said, in order to do CTR, you need a permissive environment where you're welcomed in to do activities. So right now that's not really an option right now, because that the situation is not ripe for that. Whether it will be in the future, we'll see. But right now, it's not something that we can really explore, because the political environment just was not really ripe for that.
Well, this brings the program to a close. I want to thank Ambassador Jenkins for spending all this time with us and offering her thoughts about various points on the CTR program. I personally am very hot on the CTR. I think it's a wonderful program, despite some of the problems that need to be addressed. But the problem of this complexity, obviously, you're going to have problems along the way. So, and thank you all for coming here today. I hope this was helpful to you in terms of understanding the CTR program. And let's all give Ambassador Jenkins a